Well, I've learned that I take notes like Jonathan Ott. I have maybe 10 pages here, which is insane. So I'm going to do the impossible task of speaking about something that I love very much in maybe 30 minutes. So I'm going to start with a story because that's pretty grounding for me. When I was 16 years old, I dropped out of high school. I really love learning. I still love learning, but I didn't like high school at all. I don't know if you call it high school here in the UK, but secondary school. Okay, so I dropped out of secondary school, but I found a really interesting program where I could start attending college because I had proper test scores and such in advance, and then did a completion program. The first college class I signed up for was Anthropology of Magic, Witchcraft, and Religion, because it sounded fun. And I was very shy at the time, so I was reading a book kind of tucked into this back. No, I'm still a little shy. I was reading a book tucked into the back nook, but the book had a very bright cover. It was Hallucinogens and Shamanism by Michael Herner. And the teacher saw it from afar, and he came up to me and he said, "What are you reading?" And I thought, oh shit, I'm about to get in big trouble, because this was before anything was semi-legal or anything like that. He said, "Come talk to me after class. I'd like to speak to you." Long story short, his name is John Baker, and he came the next week and gave me a gift. And the gift was a 1996, I think, copy of the yearbook for ethnomedicine and the study of consciousness, co-edited by him and Christian Ratch. So I want to say that because I want to say Christian Ratch's name. I know he passed away recently, and he was a speaker at this conference in previous years, and his work greatly influenced who I am and how I study. So anyway, that's a little story time. Let's talk about Amanita muscaria. So who likes this mushroom? Who has ingested this mushroom? Ooh, okay, friends, hi. So yeah, why did I start studying Amanita muscaria? It's multifold. First and foremost, I have a deep interest in understanding the entheogens of my ancestors. So this started as a quest, which is why, I fell in love firstly with the Solanaceae plants and the flying ointment traditions, which maybe I could talk about next breaking convention, but then it led to the Amanita. And part of my interest, besides seeking my own ancestral entheogens, is this sort of edge that we ride between something that is the most perhaps iconic mushroom. We have an emoji for it, and yet it's incredibly feared. So many people feel like, oh my gosh, if I touch it, I might die, right? So there's this really interesting dichotomy that I happen to love. I'm an edge rider, so I happen to love, like, is this poison, is this medicine, and what does that even mean? What do these notions mean, and how do we conceive of these ideas, especially in the past 3+ years? What is poison and what is medicine? A big conversation to be had. So that's some of the backstory. I'm not really going to talk about Gordon Wasson's work today because I feel like that's the most talked about thing in relationship with Amanita muscaria. I'll maybe do a little throw to it, but let's try and dig a little deeper. So I love history, but I don't really love history textbooks. And many years ago, I ate a pretty high dose of psilocybe mushrooms, and they were like, "Yeah, you got to stop learning from people and start learning from rocks." I said, "Oh, cool." So I moved to the southwestern United States, where there's a lot of petroglyphs, and I've been studying the petroglyphs. So that's where we're going to start on our talk with mushrooms. There are mushroom motif petroglyphs all over the world. And if I had a slideshow, that would be so fancy, but I'm not very tech savvy, so that's all right. But you have Google. So there are mushroom-ish petroglyphs all over the world, and perhaps some of the most famous ones in relationship, we highly suspect, to Amanita muscaria are the Pegtamel petroglyphs in, is it Siberia? Now hold on, let me look at my notes. It's the, Siberia, Kamchatka Peninsula. And there's some feminine-looking figures with a beautiful kind of mushroom body head. But there are also mushroom petroglyphs in Spain. Interestingly enough, Spain is where the red lady was found. Y'all have heard of the red lady? Probably one of the oldest, human archaeological discoveries in relationship with mushrooms, besides Otzi the Iceman. It was bones that were covered completely in like red hematite ochre, and they found some sort of residue on her teeth. And there's suspicion that it was Amanita. We know that it was in the family. Don't know if it was muscaria. But anyway, something interesting to think about. There are mushroom-headed petroglyphs in Egypt, Algeria, even arguably the United States and Utah, but that might be a long shot. And interestingly enough, too, we have so many of the mushroom stone figurines, right, in Mesoamerica and South America. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So as we move forward in the context of iconography, we have petroglyphs, and nowadays we don't really make petroglyphs anymore, but we really connect with media, right? Wow, this is really meta. This is actually really meta to turn back right now. We connect with media, so I think a lot about what were the things that inspired me as a youth. And does anybody know of the cartoon David the Gnome? Yeah, David the. That's my karaoke song, the theme song for David the Gnome. But David the Gnome and the Smurfs. I grew up in the 1980s, so David the Gnome and the Smurfs were a huge, impactful iconography and imagery that imprinted on my mind and my heart as a youngster. David the Gnome was an acupuncturist herbalist gnome that treated animals in the forest. So right away I was like, whoop, now I'm an animist. Oh my gosh, I have to rush through my notes so fast. We're not really going to talk about morphology. You know what Amanita muscaria is, right? The interesting thing actually that I will say about morphology is Amanita muscaria has something in its form that we call a vulva, right? Mushroom, V-O-L-V-A. When I first read that, I was like, oh wow, I love etymology. I was like, does this have any connection to vulva? So I started doing a little bit of digging, and if you look in the etymology dictionary, vulva, in Germanic paganism, a seeress, a woman said to have the ability to foretell the future, a woman who performs sorcery, vulva, staff bearer, a wise woman. So, here we have these motifs about fertility, sex, and death that are so common with so many of these European entheogens. Okay. The forbidden fruit, poison as medicine. We kind of talked about that. I have a Jonathan Ott quote here. Just go talk to him. I'm going to try and do a really weirdly quick global survey. So, of course, we associate Amanita muscaria with Siberia and like Hyperborean, northern regions. And of course, this has been very, very much overly memed, especially I feel like in the past 2 years, which has been a little bit triggering for me. We'll get to that in a second. I feel like it dilutes the deep global history. And there's oftentimes this inclination that we have as humans to put things in a neat little package and be like, well, of course Santa was a shaman. I'm like, it's so much deeper than that. So, okay. We first heard about the Siberian connection with Amanita muscaria, we Westerners, by way of a military prisoner who wrote about his experience in Siberia. A few decades later, after the 1700s that this was written, there were follow-ups to this, blah, blah, blah. And people were talking about the Amanita muscaria being worked with as an aid to vigor, but then also to aid in storytelling, to aid in prophecy, to aid in divination, diagnosis, for flight, for ancestral connection, right? So a really interesting range of experiences. And if I can get to the pharmacology at the end, we'll talk about why some of these things make sense. I also want to talk about animals really fast. So, of course, we hear this connection with Amanita muscaria and the reindeer. There are lots and lots and lots of animals that have been seen eating Amanita muscaria. And as someone I'm stepping over here as a practicing herbalist, Ash, because that's how I pay my bills. I'm an ethnobotanist and a researcher at heart, but I also do herbalism work. And I really feel that animals were our first terrestrial teachers of herbalism. And this is a really interesting Cartesian act of science, is the act of observation, right? So we can observe what animals are eating and returning to, even if they experience drunkenness, even if they're drooling, drooling like the Dickens, but go back for more. So we've seen not just the reindeer eating Amanita muscaria, but bears. In fact, bears will eat Amanita muscaria when it's mating season, and it's thought that they're eating it to gain courage so that they can kind of battle it out to seek their mate. So really interesting, right? Chipmunks, squirrels, flies, caribou, tigers, lots of stuff about non-human animals eating Amanita muscaria. I have a whole thing about the reindeer pee and urine therapy in here. I don't know if I'm going to talk about that. Is that like a trend out here in the UK? Is people drinking their own pee? No? Okay. So, I mean, this whole, because you'll have heard, right? You've heard, oh, people drink the reindeer pee, right? So this idea that the body is the distillation mechanism, right? Our body is a beautiful scientific instrument that does all kinds of cool things with cool chemistry. So the idea of the urine drinking, which we'll hop to maybe a little bit later, is the idea that, when we ingest something like Amanita muscaria, for example, we're decarboxylating through the heat of our digestive tract, through the fire of our belly, through the fire of the head. We're decarboxylating and the chemistry changes, and then that affects us differently. And if someone were to drink our own urine, that would affect that person differently. There'd be more muscimol in there. So I'm going to skip all these Bible quotes about drinking pee. There are a bunch. What's really funny is I had this amazing privilege of studying with this naturopathic doctor, Dr. Profrock. Shout out Dr. Profrock in Arizona. And I asked him, I said, hey, what did you do your doctoral thesis on, to finish medical college? And he's like, oh, autologous therapies. I was like, okay, self-healing. Like, so what do you mean? And he's like, oh, urine therapy. I was like, you? Anyway, so we'll talk about pee out there. India, the Vedic thing. So yeah, that's, everyone talks about Gordon Wasson. I mean, Gordon Wasson wrote the book Soma, which is really a really interesting read. His argument is that the Soma that was spoken about in Rig Veda is Amanita muscaria. Some of the key points of his argument were that it was born without seed. It was likened to an udder that is milked, the mainstay of the sky, the pillar of the world. What else? It wears a vestiture of grand occasion, red like a bull with wool like a sheep, also called hari, dazzling and flaming. So anyway, there's some really interesting arguments to what is the Soma. I like them all. I'm not here to say that there was just one plant or one mushroom that was the Soma, the sacred elixir of immortality. I think that there are many, many cool ideas, whether it's poppy, whether it's ephedra, that would all get us to really interesting places where we could have interesting encounters. So, because of holy schmack, I'm going to just skip a bunch of stuff right now. So, oh my God. Europe, pre-Vatican, pagan. I mean, we all know that Amanita muscaria is associated with good luck charms, associated with winter solstice, associated with New Year's celebrations. My Christmas commentary is, while I do find the correlations between Amanita and the Santa story really interesting, I think the nature of how things are shared in memology can be kind of a disservice to the global importance of Amanita. And I know a lot of us who have, from the global north, have a longing to connect with our ancestors. That's certainly why I started studying Amanita muscaria. But I don't think it's fair to just place it there when clearly there's connections to Amanita pantherina in Africa, Amanita muscaria in Mesoamerica. Gnomes, let's talk about my favorite thing ever, gnomes. So European indigeneity and myth, because of the nature of the Vatican Church and how things went down in Europe, my feeling is that fairy tales were the way that we could encode some of our traditional information as a way to keep it safe, because it wasn't literal anymore. It was out there. There's an amazing Tolkien quote. He says, "Fairy stories are not in normal English usage stories about fairies or elves, but stories about capital F, fairy, the realm or state in which fairies have their being. Fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, and the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. So gnome, what does gnome mean? Who are the gnomes? Who are the gnomes? Does anyone, who do you think the gnomes are? Yeah, I'm not going to do my Terrence impression, but yeah. Huh? Chomsky. Okay, so so if you were to look up gnome in a dictionary, dwarf-like earth-dwelling spirit, but let's go a little bit deeper than that. From the French gnome, from the medieval Latin nomus, used in the 16th century in a treatise by Paracelsus, who gave the name pygmy or gnomi to elemental earth beings, possibly from Greek genomus, or earth dweller. Really, really interesting. Let's talk about the prefix too, GNO. Where else do we see that prefix? Gnosis, straight up. So to know from direct experience. And like I will quote the great John Trudell, where he said, belief has a big lie right in the middle of it. You either know or you don't know. You either know or you don't know. And I think that's a true testament, as psychonauts, we either know or we don't know. We eat the thing. We F around and find out, right? So to know, what does it mean to know? And really, who are the gnomes? What is the iconography behind the garden gnome and this relationship to direct experience, but not just direct experience, but now we're talking about something that maybe referenced the pygmies. And if we look at many pygmies, right? And if we look at many of the oldest humans on planet Earth that we know of, they're also the smallest in stature humans that we know of on planet Earth. So there's something really interesting there to me. And where do gnomes like to hang out? Oh, my friend. Yeah. It's so fascinating because there are gnomes all over the world. And I was just in Oaxaca. I had the privilege of going to Huautla de Jimenez last autumn for the mushroom season. And there's a certain type of corn that's not grown for humans to eat. It's for the chaniques, they call it. This type of corn is grown for the gnomes, the chaniques. They're the little beings, the little interdimensional beings that protect your land. So we have traditions of these little interdimensional beings all over the world who really like to receive offerings, so make sure you leave your offerings out. So yeah, where do gnomes like to hang out? Well, they like to hang out under toadstools. So what's the deal with the toadstool? Why toadstool? Some people think that the name happened because it was thought that toads secreted their poisons, their toxins into the mushroom, right? And then there were, fast forward, some people made these accounts like, oh yeah, there's bufotenine in Amanita muscaria, and there's much debate on that. 5-MeO, DMT. We can talk about toads out there. I live in the Sonoran Desert with the bufo alvarius toad. Father Christmas, lightning, and the rod. Well, my favorite thing, so I'm a lightning devotee. That's also part of why I live in the southwestern United States, is because we have the best storms. We have the best storms during monsoon season and summertime. So lightning, Father Christmas. Okay, Father Christmas. Some stories show Father Christmas carrying a black birch rod of divinity. Birch, We all know that Amanita muscaria is mycorrhizal, right? What are some of the trees it likes to grow with? Pine, birch, ash, Okay, so Father Christmas carries a birch rod of divinity, right? It's the rod of correction. You whack the bad children with it. Interesting also to note that the Yule log is suspected to be made out of ash. And then Yggdrasil, the world tree ash, all of these are mycorrhizal, relations with Amanita muscaria. What was I going to say? So a lot of these lightning deities that we see all over the world have a connection to Amanita and have a connection to carrying some kind of wooden rod or rod that's fashioned by fairies. We could talk about Odin, right? He carries a mystical spear called the Gungir, fashioned from the elves, by the elves. He has one eye. Ravens are his animal companions. Oh my gosh. And his son is Thor, created lightning by swinging his hammer. We have Indra, right? Indra, this is in India, deity of heaven, lightning, thunder, storms, and rains, kills the great symbolic evil Ritter, who's the personification of drought. And he wields a vajra. Who knows what a vajra is? Vajra in Tibetan, it's bone shamanism, but became Tibetan Buddhism. The vajra is considered the cosmic thunderbolt. It's a really interesting shaped tool that's actually a toroidal field. It's really cool. And it also incorporates a purba, which is a spear. It's a ritual dagger. We have Padmasambhava in Tibet. Padmasambhava is a deity that's also associated with lightning and the purba. We have Shango in the Yoruba traditions of Nigeria. Does anyone know what colors he wears?
Red and black.
Red and white. Red and white, He has a really beautiful skirt, like a long gown, and he has a really specific dance where he spins around and the skirt looks like an incredible Amanita mushroom cap. And he wears a really interesting hat. Does anyone know what kind of hat Shango wears? So we're in, what room are we in right now? We're in the Kalindi room, right? Which is an honor, by the way, to call his name into Hi Kalindi in the spirit world. Kalindi, what kind of hat did he wear? Looked kind of like a Smurf hat, right? There's a name for that kind of hat. It's called a Phrygian cap. Has anyone heard of this? Oh my gosh, I'm so intrigued by this hat. So what's the story with the Phrygian cap? I'm scooting all the way to that right now. Connected with the Scythians, it's also considered a victory cap. It's common in Eurasia, it's common in pagan traditions, it's common amongst African elites. It was associated with the French Revolution. It was a universal declaration of human rights and liberty movements. Wearing this hat. This hat would also be seen not just on people, but placed on poles, and they would call them liberty poles, or freedom poles, or liberty trees. We still see it to this day on coats of arms. We still see it on coins. We also connect this kind of cap to Mithras. Really interesting to think about the Mithraic traditions. There was an actual goddess named Phrygia, and she was the Mother Earth. But she was also the goddess of the hunt. Really interesting to think, too, about the connection with entheogens and the hunt. Anyway, I'm going off on a total tangent right now. But the Phrygian cap, so, now backtrack a little back to the Smurfs, right? And I'm like, so what actually was the deal with the Smurfs? And what were they trying to, we don't have petroglyphs, but we have Smurfs. So what were they trying to tell us with the Smurfs? And who was the bad guy in the Smurfs? Gargamel. Who's Gargamel? The bad guy, but not just the bad guy in the Smurfs. There was actually he wore all black, right? What was his cat's name? Azrael. Whoa, who's Azrael? Wow, really interesting, right? Oh shit. Okay, excuse me. My time card. So we're going to talk about chemistry. I'm going to fast forward. I got so excited. But the Smurf thing, let me just say this. There is a historical account of a Gargamel from the 12th or 13th century who was a well-known priest from the Dominican order and was in charge of carrying out the Inquisition in ancient Europe. So now we have that, the bad guy and the Smurfs, and then these like little guys wearing Phrygian caps. Okay. Oh, Lord. I have a 6-hour version of this class online, just so you all know. We're going to fast forward all the way to chemistry right now. So I'm changing the hemispheres of my brain. Chemistry of Amanita muscaria. Oftentimes we're going to hear the main components are ibotenic acid and muscimol, right? There's also muscarine. There's also a huge amount of vitamin D. So when we think about Amanita muscaria in lower doses being associated with giving vigor and bringing like energy and enthusiasm to the mundane tasks of the day, I actually think vitamin D could be a main component of why this is happening. The ibotenic acid and muscimol thing. So I think there's really interesting physiological implications of both and spiritual implications of both. Ibotenic acid is an NDMA receptor agonist, right? So really, really interesting in relationship to memory formation, neuroplasticity, locomotion, learning, all kinds of stuff. I think that there could be some really interesting promise in relationship to neurological diseases and having a relationship with Amanita muscaria. But ibotenic acid is what's also considered a neurotoxin. Why do you think? Well, why is it considered a neurotoxin? Because when they did testing on rats, they injected, and rabbits, they injected it directly into their brains. I've never heard of any traditional peoples injecting Amanita muscaria into their brains. So this is something we could also talk about on the sidelines, is the problem of how clinical testing is done, oftentimes not referencing at all any kind of traditional use at all. Ibotenic acid will make you sweat and drool profusely. It can feel incredibly uncomfortable, but I think there's something interesting to that initiation. When that gets decarboxylated through heat or through certain means of preparation, it becomes muscimol. And muscimol is a GABA agonist, which is super, super, super interesting. GABA is a neurotransmitter. It plugs right in and basically acts as a sedative by reducing the input of being overwhelmed by its sensory stimulation. Really, really interesting stuff there that, again, we'll have to talk about somewhere, some other time. I'm also really intrigued by some of the historical accounts of fermentation as a way to decarboxylate. There's all kinds of stuff talking about people fermenting it in milk. I've been doing weird experiments with kombucha. What do I want to say? A lot of people, I'll end it really fast. Is that okay? A lot of people consider Amanita muscaria in high doses a dissociative sedative. And the way that I want to end this is disassociate from what? Right now, I think there is a call for us to disassociate from a lot of things, including an overculture that has never really served us in the first place. It's served kind of a corporate scenario. So disassociate from what? I know when I ingest Amanita muscaria, I don't disassociate completely from the world. I disassociate from my mind. I can exist without this thing churning and churning and churning and churning. I have like the radio brain where it just doesn't stop. So I disassociate from this, but I can exist as a body. So many people will ask me, they'll be like, oh, is Amanita like psilocybin? And I'm like, that's like saying, am I like you? I'm like, well, yes and no. I'm sure we're similar in some ways, but Amanita, I feel like if serotonergic compounds like psilocybin are like, I am one with all things, I am like the rooting hormone auxin that can branch out and perceive new space and be creative and be curious and connect. Amanita muscaria as I am. You know, yeah, psilocybin, I'm one with all, and Amanita muscaria is I am. And that I am doesn't require this thing. Although this thing can be cool. So, yeah, clearly I have a lot to say. I'm really honored that I had the opportunity to speak and have a mic. And I don't know if I have time for questions, but find me and we can talk more. Yeah.